The weapon that Hietanen was using on the hull of the T-28 did not have a name yet, not a Finnish name, not any name that the men throwing it had agreed on. In the weeks before the war, Finnish officers attached to civil defense organizations had been experimenting with improvised incendiary devices based on the simple physics of flammable liquid and an ignition source. Devices that could be carried by infantry, thrown at close range, and that would ignite on impact if the delivery mechanism worked correctly. The experiments were not systematic. There was no centralized Finnish research program for improvised anti-armor weapons in October 1939. There was awareness, drawn from reports of the Spanish Civil War, that nationalist forces fighting in Spain had used bottles of gasoline against Soviet-supplied tanks with some reported success. And there was the recognition, obvious to any Finnish officer who looked at the numbers, that Finland's anti-tank gun inventory was so small relative to the Soviet armor that it would be exhausted in the first weeks of heavy contact. The anti-tank gun situation was not merely inadequate. It was catastrophic by any conventional military planning standard. Finnish army inventories in November 1939 counted approximately 100 anti-tank guns of various calibers, many of them of First World War vintage, with ammunition stocks that military planners estimated would be consumed within 2 weeks of sustained armored contact on the Karelian Isthmus alone. Against 6,541 Soviet tanks, 100 guns with 2 weeks of ammunition was a number that did not produce a military plan. It produced a search for alternatives. The bottle was the alternative. The Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov provided the name inadvertently through a lie. When Soviet bombers struck Helsinki on November 30th, 1939, the opening day of the invasion, killing civilians in the residential districts of the Finnish capital and destroying buildings that had no military function, Molotov announced on Moscow radio that the Soviet aircraft were not dropping bombs on Finnish cities. They were dropping bread. Humanitarian aid for the Finnish workers who would soon be liberated from their bourgeois government. The explanation was offered with the serene confidence of a state that had concluded its own population would believe whatever it was told, and that the international community would either accept the framing or lack the standing to challenge it. The Finnish soldiers who watched the bombs fall on Helsinki did not receive this statement with the credulity Molotov had perhaps expected. They began calling the Soviet air bombs Molotov bread baskets. And the bottles they were throwing at Soviet tanks, the bottles that went with the bread, became Molotov cocktails. A toast to Molotov. The naming was a piece of black humor that told you more about the Finnish situation in December 1939 than any official communique. A nation outnumbered 100-1 in armor, facing an enemy that lied about bombing civilians, finding time in the interval between tank attacks to make a joke about it. The humor was not incidental, it was structural. It was the specific response of people who had looked at the situation clearly, understood exactly how bad it was, and decided that the alternative to laughing was something they were not prepared to do. The gasoline mixture inside the bottles was not originally gasoline. Pure gasoline burns quickly but does not adhere well to metal surfaces, which means the fire it produces is intense but brief, and a brief fire may not penetrate into the tank through the openings available to infantry attack before the flames die out and the crew recovers and the tank keeps moving. Finnish soldiers in the first weeks of the war experimented with mixtures that would burn longer and hotter and stick to whatever surface they struck. The formulation that became standard in Finnish production by mid-December 1939 combined gasoline with tar, which gave the burning liquid a thick adhesive quality that caused it to cling to metal surfaces and maintain contact with the ignition source for a significantly longer period than gasoline alone, and potassium chlorate, which acted as an oxidizer and allowed the mixture to burn even when deprived of external oxygen. This last property mattered because the most effective points of attack on a Soviet tank were the air intake vents and the engine compartment, where the burning mixture could reach fuel lines and mechanical components, and where the fire would be fed partly by the engine's own air supply and partly by the chemical oxidizer in the mixture itself. The formulation was not developed in a laboratory. It was developed in the field by soldiers who were dying from Soviet armor and who needed the bottle to work better, who tried pure gasoline and found it insufficient, who added tar from road repair stockpiles and found the adhesion improved, who added potassium chlorate from agricultural supply stores and found the sustained burn extended far enough to matter. They tried things until they found combinations that worked and then told each other about it. And then those combinations became standard through the informal transmission that armies use when doctrine has not caught up with necessity. And men are dying in the gap between what doctrine says and what the situation requires. The production of the bottles became an organizational act within weeks of the war's beginning. The Finnish state distillery, Oi Alko Ab, which under normal circumstances produced the vodka and spirits consumed by the Finnish civilian population, was redirected toward filling half-liter glass bottles with the tar gasoline potassium chlorate mixture and attaching to the neck of each bottle a pair of storm matches, the waterproof type that could be ignited even in wet conditions, bound with wire and oriented so that striking them against a rough surface lit both matches simultaneously. The matches burned for several seconds before the bottle impacted its target, long enough for a man to throw the bottle with reasonable accuracy, short enough that he was not holding a burning object for an uncomfortable period before release. The storm match ignition system solved a problem that had plagued improvised incendiary weapons since their use in Spain: how to ensure reliable ignition at the moment of impact rather than before or after. A bottle that ignites in the thrower's hand is worse than no bottle at all. A bottle that fails to ignite on impact is a glass container of flammable liquid sitting on or near a tank whose crew will shortly investigate the noise of broken glass against their hull. The storm match system produced reliable ignition in conditions that included temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius, winds of up to 40 kilometers per hour, and the physical stress of a man throwing under fire from a position he had been lying in, motionless for hours. Alko produced approximately 450,000 of these bottles during the Winter War. The number is precise because the Finnish government kept records. 450,000 bottles of a mixture designed to set Soviet tanks on fire, manufactured by a national vodka company in 105 days of war. Understanding why the Molotov cocktail worked against Soviet tanks in Finland in 1939 requires understanding something about Soviet tank design doctrine that the Red Army's own officers understood, but that Soviet political leadership had not fully absorbed. The tanks crossing into Finland in November 1939 were products of a design philosophy that prioritized armor protection and firepower for open ground operations against conventional military opponents who would be engaging the tanks from the front at range with anti-tank guns or other armored vehicles. The T-26, which was the most numerically common Soviet tank in Finland, had been designed in the late 1920s, based on a British commercial design, updated through the 1930s, and was by 1939 a vehicle with armor that was proof against small arms fire and shell fragments, but whose engine compartment and air intake systems had been located at the rear of the vehicle, where they were least likely to receive direct fire from opponents engaging the tank frontally. This was sound design logic in the context for which the T-26 had been designed. It became a fatal vulnerability in the context of Finnish forest fighting, where the threat did not come from opponents engaging the tank frontally at range, but from infantry who had allowed the tank to pass their position and were attacking it from behind at distances measured in meters. The location of the air intake louvers at the rear of the vehicle, which reduced their exposure to conventional anti-tank weapons, maximized their exposure to a bottle thrown by a man lying in a foxhole that the tank had just rolled over. Soviet tank doctrine assumed combined arms coordination that the Finnish terrain made impossible to achieve, and that Finnish tactics were specifically designed to prevent. The standard Soviet operational concept for armored advance required tanks and infantry to move together, with the infantry clearing wooded or built-up areas of anti-tank teams before the armor entered those areas, and the armor suppressing defensive fire that would otherwise pin the infantry. This mutual dependency was sound doctrine on open ground. In Finnish forest, where the trees prevented armored vehicles from moving off roads, and where Finnish soldiers occupying concealed positions in those same trees could engage both the infantry and the armor simultaneously, the mutual dependency collapsed. Soviet infantry following tanks on forest roads were hit by Finnish fire from the trees on both sides of the road. When the infantry took casualties and went to ground, the tanks continued moving because stopping made them stationary targets for Finnish anti-tank guns. When the tanks moved ahead of the infantry lost the suppression the tanks had been providing and took more casualties. The cycle was self-reinforcing, and it produced consistently across every sector of the Finnish front tanks operating without infantry support in terrain where infantry was their only protection against the one weapon available in quantities sufficient to threaten them. The result was that a design flaw that had existed in the T-26 since 1928 suddenly became a tactical liability in December 1939 in a forest outside Suma, because Finnish tactics had created the conditions under which the flaw could be exploited by a man with a bottle. The specific vulnerability of Soviet tanks to the Molotov cocktail was not uniform across all tank types or all attack scenarios. The T-26 was most vulnerable at the engine compartment rear, where the air intake louvers were accessible to a bottle thrown from behind or from the side. A successful hit at this location could force burning mixture into the engine bay, where it ignited engine components and fuel lines and created a fire that the crew, operating in a sealed armored vehicle, could not reach with their own fire suppression equipment, which in most Soviet tanks of this period consisted of handheld extinguishers that required opening hatches, which exposed the crew to Finnish infantry who were waiting for exactly that. The larger T-28 medium tank, which Hietanen had been fighting at Suma, had a more complex engine arrangement distributed across a wider rear section and required multiple bottle hits to achieve the same effect that a single well-placed bottle could achieve on a T-26. Finnish anti-tank teams therefore learned to work in coordination, typically groups of 3 or 4 men with assigned roles that were established before the engagement, and that did not require communication during it, because communication during a tank attack in a forest at night in winter was not reliably possible, and planning for it was planning for failure. One man would attract the tank's attention from the front, moving enough to draw the tank's machine gun fire at the attention of the driver, while 2 or 3 others approached from the flanks and rear with bottles. The coordination required for this tactic under fire, in darkness, in -30-degree temperatures, by men who had received perhaps 2 weeks of military training before the war began and who had not practiced this specific sequence at all, was something that Finnish after-action reports describe with a matter-of-factness that does not fully communicate how extraordinary the execution was. The Soviet experience of the Molotov cocktail produced institutional reports that tell a story different from the tactical one. Soviet officers writing after-action assessments of engagements where their armor had been stopped or destroyed by Finnish infantry using incendiary bottles were required to explain, in the formal language of military reporting, how vehicles weighing 10 tons and protected by steel plate had been rendered non-operational by devices that cost less than a meal to produce. The explanations they produced revealed the cognitive difficulty of the situation. Some reports attributed the effectiveness of the Finnish incendiary weapons to a specially formulated chemical mixture with properties beyond those of ordinary flammable liquids, which was partially accurate in that the tar-potassium chlorate mixture performed better than pure gasoline, but which overstated the sophistication of what was essentially a field expedient. Other reports attributed the vulnerability of Soviet vehicles to specific manufacturing defects in the air intake systems of affected tank models, which was a way of locating the problem in the production chain rather than in the tactical doctrine, because a production chain problem could be reported to industrial authorities and addressed through engineering, whereas a doctrinal problem required acknowledging that the fundamental approach to armored warfare in forested terrain was wrong, which was not a conclusion that Soviet officers in December 1939 were institutionally positioned to draw and survive. The Great Purge had removed from the Red Army approximately 35,000 officers between 1937 and 1938, including 3 of 5 marshals and the majority of experienced corps and division commanders. Those who remained had survived by demonstrating loyalty over competence, by avoiding the kind of independent tactical thinking that in Stalin's army could be interpreted as ideological deviation. Telling Moscow that Soviet tank doctrine was fundamentally unsuited to Finnish conditions was the kind of report that produced arrests. Telling Moscow that Finnish incendiary weapons were chemically sophisticated and that Soviet manufacturing had produced flawed air intake systems was the kind of report that produced investigations of factory managers. One outcome was survivable, the other was not. The Finnish soldiers who became proficient with the Molotov cocktail were not a specialized unit and did not undergo specialized training for the role. They were regular infantry, the majority of them reservists who had been farmers, loggers, factory workers, and small business owners in October 1939, and who had been called up in the weeks before the invasion and issued rifles and told approximately what was coming. The anti-tank mission fell to whoever was near the tanks when the tanks appeared, which in the motty environment that Finnish commanders were creating along the Karelian front was frequently regular rifle infantry positioned in concealed foxholes beside forest roads that Soviet armor was using as its only practical avenue of advance. The learning curve was steep and it was paid for in casualties. Finnish soldiers who approached tanks incorrectly, who threw too early and exposed their position before they were close enough for accuracy, who failed to account for the wind carrying the flame back toward them, who hit the frontal armor rather than the engine compartment, who broke and ran rather than holding their position until the tank was at the required distance, contributed to a body of negative knowledge that the men who survived them absorbed and transmitted. The Finnish army had no formal doctrine for infantry anti-tank fighting with improvised weapons in December 1939. By January 1940, it had something better than doctrine. It had several thousand men who had done it and lived, and who could teach it to the men who had not. At the Suma defensive position on the Karelian Isthmus, which was the sector where Soviet armor committed its heaviest effort during the first phase of the Winter War, the scale of armored assault that Finnish soldiers were asked to face exceeded what any reasonable pre-war planning had contemplated. The Soviet 7th Army, attacking on the isthmus, deployed armor in concentrations that reflected the standard Soviet doctrine of mass. Tanks forward, in numbers sufficient to overwhelm defensive positions by attrition, if not by maneuver, infantry following in waves, artillery preparation preceding each major assault in efforts that consumed ammunition at rates that Soviet logistics had not fully planned for. The problem at Suma was the same problem that Soviet armor encountered everywhere in Finland in December 1939 and January 1940. The forest absorbed the infantry, the frozen terrain channeled the tanks onto roads and cleared fields where Finnish defenders knew exactly where they would appear, and the coordination between armor and infantry that Soviet doctrine required broke down within minutes of first contact with Finnish defensive fire and did not recover within the time frame of any individual engagement. Soviet tank crews found themselves moving through terrain without infantry protection, past tree lines that Finnish soldiers had occupied before dawn, along road axes that Finnish engineers had prepared with obstacles and that Finnish anti-tank teams had registered as firing positions days before the attack began. The tactical situation that resulted was not a contest between a sophisticated weapon system and an improvised one. It was a contest between a weapon system employed according to a doctrine developed for different terrain against opponents who had spent months thinking about exactly this landscape and exactly this equipment. Simo Haiha did not use Molotov cocktails. This requires direct statement because the Winter War's most recognized individual soldier is sometimes associated in popular accounts with the full range of Finnish unconventional capability, as though the qualities that made Finland's defense remarkable were concentrated in a single man whose legend can absorb them all. Heiha's actual contribution was specific, narrow, and almost unclassifiable in the context of military history. A sniper operating alone with a bolt-action Mosin-Nagant rifle fitted with iron sights rather than an optical scope, because Heiha had concluded that the telescopic sight elevated his head enough above the snow surface to make him more visible to Soviet observers, and that he could shoot with sufficient accuracy using the iron sights he had used since childhood, who in 98 days of winter combat accumulated 542 confirmed kills of Soviet soldiers. The number 542 requires contextualization because without it, it reads as a statistic rather than as a description of something that happened 542 times. Each kill required Heiha to move to a position before dawn, before Soviet patrols had begun their day's movement, and lie still in the snow in temperatures that routinely fell below -30 degrees Celsius for periods that could extend to several hours before a target presented itself. Still enough that no movement drew a Soviet observer's attention. Silent enough that no sound indicated a human presence. Concealed well enough by the white smock he wore over his uniform that at the distances from which he fired, typically between 300 and 500 meters, he was visually indistinguishable from the snow around him. He did this 542 times and returned from each occasion, which means he also successfully disengaged 542 times from a position that Soviet soldiers were attempting to locate after the shot, often with counter-sniper teams whose specific mission was to find him. He was not found. He was hit once on March 6, 1940, 6 days before the war ended, by a shot that removed a portion of his jaw, and he was unconscious when the ceasefire came into effect. He recovered slowly. He outlived the Soviet Union. The Soviet response to Finnish sniper activity, including Heiha's specifically, once his operational pattern had been identified from the pattern of casualties in his sector, followed a sequence that became familiar across multiple theaters of the Winter War. Counter-sniper teams were deployed. Their effectiveness was limited by the same factors that made the Finnish sniper so difficult to neutralize. They were operating in terrain that the Finnish soldier knew better, using senses that the cold and the darkness and the dense forest degraded more severely for men who had not grown up in this environment, against an opponent who moved only when movement was safe, and who did not need to move frequently because his range and his patience meant that targets came to him rather than the reverse. Artillery was used to shell areas where Finnish sniper activity was concentrated. The shells fell on forest that absorbed them, on snow that swallowed the fragments, on a landscape that was not organized in ways that made area fire effective against individual men who were lying flat and who were, when the shelling began, already moving to a different position. The psychological effect on Soviet units operating in sectors where Heiha was active was documented in commissar reports that described soldiers reluctant to cross open ground, reluctant to occupy positions near windows or other apertures that provided sightlines at range, reluctant to perform the routine movements of military life that in other circumstances required no conscious consideration. The specific fear that Heiha's presence created was not the general fear of being killed that all soldiers carry in war. It was the specific fear of being observed without knowing it, of being selected without knowing it, of dying from a decision that had already been made about you by a man you could not see and could not influence and could not deter. This is a different category of fear from artillery or air attack, both of which are impersonal and both of which can be partially addressed by dispersion or concealment or movement. Heiha's fire was personal in the sense that it was directed at individuals who had been observed and chosen, and the impossibility of knowing whether you were being observed and chosen at any given moment produced in Soviet soldiers a relationship with open ground that their commissar reports described as paralytic. The Motti encirclements that Finnish commanders employed across the front, from the Karelian Isthmus north through Suomussalmi and beyond, were the context within which both the Molotov cocktail and the sniper operated most effectively. Understanding the Motti as a tactic requires understanding what it did to the psychology of the force it enclosed, not just to its physical capability. A Soviet column encircled in Finnish forest was a force that could not advance, could not retreat, could not be resupplied, and could not identify the enemy that had surrounded it clearly enough to engage it decisively. The forest swallowed Finnish soldiers the way the ocean swallows a diver. They moved through it, and the surface closed behind them, and there was no trace. Soviet soldiers in encircled positions sent radio messages that described the experience in terms that their training had not equipped them for. They described firing at sounds and hitting nothing. They described patrols that entered the forest and did not return. They described sentries who were found dead at their posts with no indication of how or from which direction the shot had come. They described the specific psychological deterioration of men who were cold and hungry and had been under intermittent fire for days from an enemy they could not see, and who had begun to lose the ability to distinguish between sounds that required response and sounds that were the forest itself, which in Finnish winter is not silent. Ice contracts and produces sounds. Trees shed snow loads and produce sounds. Animals move and produce sounds. A Soviet soldier in a Finnish forest in January 1940, after 3 weeks of being shot at from positions he could not locate, heard all of these sounds as potential threats and responded to them with the expenditure of nervous energy that the cold and the hunger and the insufficient sleep amplified into a degradation of combat effectiveness that no enemy action was required to produce. The forest was doing it. The Motai did not need Finnish soldiers inside it to destroy the encircled Soviet force. It needed only time and temperature, and Finland in January had unlimited quantities of both. At Suomussalmi, where Finnish Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo applied the Motti principle at the largest scale of the Winter War, the Soviet 44th and 163rd Divisions entered a wilderness of 80 kilometers of forest road with the mission of cutting Finland in half at its narrowest point and threatening the rear of Finnish forces on the Karelian Isthmus. Silasvuo had 11,000 men against approximately 45,000 Soviets, a ratio that in any conventional military assessment produced a single conclusion. Silasvuo did not conduct a conventional assessment. He divided his force, attacked the Soviet column at multiple points, simultaneously using the tree felling technique that created barriers faster than Soviet engineers could clear them, cut the column into isolated segments, and then addressed each segment separately with forces that were locally superior even when globally outnumbered. The 163rd Division was encircled and destroyed. When the 44th Division advanced to relieve it, Silasvuo cut the 44th into its own encirclements. By early January 1940, approximately 27,500 Soviet soldiers were surrounded in the Suomussalmi wilderness, 80 kilometers from the nearest Soviet supply base, in temperatures that fell to -40 degrees Celsius with food for 4 days. The Molotov cocktails that Finnish soldiers carried into the Suomussalmi encirclements were used against the armored vehicles in the column. The snipers who operated on the perimeter of the encirclements were used against the officers and communications personnel whose elimination degraded the encircled forces' capacity for organized response. The two weapons worked together not because Finnish commanders had planned their integration in any formal sense, but because the Motti created conditions in which both were maximally effective. Immobile targets in a confined space, under stress, without effective countermeasures, with no prospect of relief. The Soviet soldiers who survived the Suomussalmi encirclements described what happened to them in testimonies that were taken by Finnish forces and later studied by military historians. The testimonies are consistent in a way that suggests they are describing the same experience rather than constructing a narrative after the fact. The cold came first in every account, before the hunger and before the fear, because the cold was immediate in a way that nothing else was. Men who had not eaten for 2 days could function. Men who had not slept for 2 days could function. Men who were at -40 degrees without adequate clothing for that temperature could not function in a time frame measured in hours rather than days. Soviet soldiers in the Suomussalmi encirclements were wearing standard Red Army winter equipment, which had been designed for Russian winter temperatures of approximately -15 to -20 degrees Celsius. Finnish winter temperatures in the Suomussalmi area in January 1940 reached -40. The gap between those two numbers was not bridgeable by discipline or ideology or the proximity of commissars authorized to shoot men who showed insufficient revolutionary commitment. It was a gap that could only be bridged by the correct equipment, which the Soviet soldiers did not have. They built fires. The fires revealed their positions. Finnish mortar teams registered on the fires. Men who moved away from the fires died more slowly but more certainly. Men who stayed at the fires died from Finnish mortar rounds that were targeted with an accuracy that the light from the fires made possible. There was no good option. The forest, the cold, and the Finnish army had collaborated to produce a situation in which the available choices differed in their specific mechanism of death but converged on the same outcome. Moscow's response to the failures of December 1939 and January 1940 was not to question the strategic premise of the invasion or the fundamental doctrine that had produced the operational failures. Questioning strategic premises in Stalin's Soviet Union was a path that led in one direction only. Moscow replaced commanders, reorganized command structures, and applied more force. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko replaced General Kirill Merezhkov in command of the Leningrad military district on January 7, 1940, and immediately demonstrated that he understood the failures in Finland as institutional and doctrinal, rather than simply a matter of insufficient force or inadequate commanders. Timoshenko's first significant decision was to halt offensive operations across most of the front while he reorganized. This required political courage of a specific kind, because halting offensive operations against a small nation that had been predicted to collapse within 2 weeks after more than a month of fighting required explaining to Stalin why the prediction had been wrong, which was an explanation that Stalin received with the equanimity he was not known for. Timoshenko survived the explanation. He reorganized supply lines that had been operating on improvised schedules. He established proper communications between units that had been sending radio messages into the void and receiving responses that reflected headquarters' wishes rather than operational reality. He ordered white camouflage smocks for all infantry units, the request that unit commanders, including Dolzhenkov, had been submitting since December, and that the procurement system had been denying because white fabric was not a standard issue item, and creating a new procurement category required authorization that had not been forthcoming. Timoshenko authorized it. The procurement system found white fabric. The smocks were issued. Finnish snipers found their work marginally more difficult. Timoshenko's artillery preparation for the renewed offensive against the Mannerheim Line began on February 1, 1940, and continued for 11 days. 6,000 guns. This was the weapon the Soviet Union had brought to Finland and had not yet used correctly, because correct use required establishing supply lines capable of sustaining the ammunition consumption of 6,000 guns firing for 11 days, and establishing those supply lines had required the 6 weeks of reorganization that Timoshenko had spent since January. The bombardment that began on February 1st was not a preparation for infantry assault in the conventional sense of the term, where artillery fire suppresses defensive positions long enough for infantry to close the distance and assault. It was a systematic destruction program. Finnish fortifications on the Karelian Isthmus had been identified through aerial reconnaissance, prisoner interrogation, and the painful tactical intelligence gathered during December and January at enormous cost in Soviet lives. The guns that Timoshenko had assembled were registered on those positions with a precision that the first phase of the war had not approached. Finnish soldiers in the Mannerheim line bunkers described the 11-day bombardment in terms that survivors of other artillery bombardments in other wars recognized: the inability to think clearly due to continuous concussion, the deafness that came and did not go, the physical deterioration of men who could not sleep or eat properly in an environment where the ground moved continuously and where any exposed position was likely to receive a direct hit within minutes of occupation. The bunkers held, the men inside them held. But the 11 days consumed something that was not replenishable in the time frame available. And when Timoshenko's infantry advanced on February 12th behind the last phase of the bombardment, the Finnish defensive line that had held through December and January held for hours rather than days before the first breakthrough. The Mannerheim line broke on February 12, 1940. Finnish forces withdrew in stages, executing the kind of fighting retreat that requires more discipline than either attack or static defense, surrendering ground deliberately to preserve force integrity, maintaining the coherence of units that were exhausted and depleted, and fighting in conditions that had not improved since December. The withdrawal bought time. Time was what the Finnish government needed for the diplomatic process that had been running in parallel with the military one since December. The negotiations with Moscow that both sides understood would eventually produce a settlement, because both sides understood that Finland could delay but not permanently defeat a fully committed Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union could eventually break Finnish military resistance, but could not do so quickly enough to prevent the kind of international opprobrium and potential intervention that was accumulating as the war continued. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed on March 12, 1940. Finland ceded 11% of its territory. Finland retained everything else. The Molotov cocktail outlasted the war that produced it. In the summer of 1940, when German armored forces had overrun France and the possibility of a German amphibious invasion of Britain moved from theoretical to operational, the British Home Guard received instructions on the preparation and use of improvised incendiary weapons against armored vehicles. The instructions drew directly on the Finnish example, filtered through the reports of British military observers who had followed the Winter War with the close attention of a nation that understood it might face Soviet-style armored assault in different circumstances. The Home Guard version of the Molotov cocktail used a similar tar gasoline mixture and a similar ignition mechanism, modified for British industrial production standards and for distribution to volunteers who had not been soldiers and who needed instructions simple enough to follow under stress. The weapon that Finnish civil defense experimenters had developed in October 1939 had become, by the summer of 1940, standard British civilian defense doctrine. By 1941, it had spread to resistance movements across occupied Europe, to Greek partisans and Yugoslav fighters and French resistance members, and eventually to Soviet partisans operating behind German lines, who used against German armor a weapon originally developed to stop Soviet armor by a nation the Soviet Union had invaded. This is the kind of irony that military history produces when the time horizon is long enough to see it. The 450,000 bottles that Alko produced were not all used. Some were stockpiled in positions that Finnish forces subsequently abandoned under Soviet pressure, leaving behind stacks of bottles that Soviet soldiers found and examined and, in at least some documented cases, eventually understood the purpose of. Some were captured in the Moti encirclements when Finnish supply sleds were overrun. Some were lost in the chaos of the February withdrawal from the Mannerheim line. The ones that were thrown at Soviet tanks in the forests of the Karelian Isthmus and the wilderness of Suomussalmi and along the frozen lake shores of Ladoga were thrown by men who were cold and outnumbered and operating without doctrine in terrain that was familiar to them in the way that only a childhood in a place can make a landscape familiar. They did not think of themselves as making history. They thought of themselves as stopping tanks that would otherwise reach the positions behind them where other Finnish soldiers were trying to hold a line that, if it broke, left nothing between the Soviet advance and everything Finland had. The distinction mattered to them in December 1939. The history happened anyway. There is a specific quality to the weapon that explains its persistence across 8 decades of irregular warfare and numerous conflicts in which forces with limited conventional capability faced armored vehicles they could not engage with standard anti-armor weapons. The Molotov cocktail requires materials that are available in every inhabited place on Earth: glass containers, flammable liquid, and ignition source. It requires physical courage of the kind that proximity to an armored vehicle demands, which is a different and more visceral kind of courage than the courage required to fire a rifle at a distant opponent, because a tank is large and loud, and its machine guns fire in arcs that make the approach to its vulnerable surfaces a path through fire. It requires knowledge of which surfaces are vulnerable and which are not. Knowledge that Finnish soldiers developed through casualties in December 1939 and transmitted to each other through the informal instruction of men who had survived teaching men who had not yet tried. It does not require a supply chain, a factory, a logistics system, or any of the industrial infrastructure that conventional weapons require. This is why it appears in Budapest in 1956 and Belfast in the 1970s and Kyiv in 2022, and in every conflict in between where the tactical situation resembles what Finnish soldiers faced at Suma in December 1939. A weaker force in confined terrain with armor close enough to approach and nothing better available. The Finnish soldiers who threw Molotov cocktails at Soviet tanks in the Winter War did not know they were creating a weapon that would be used for the rest of the century and beyond. They knew they were trying to stop the tank in front of them from reaching the men behind them. Paavo Hietanen, climbing onto the hull of a burning T-28 at 0340 hours on December 17, 1939, was not thinking about military history or weapons doctrine or the future of improvised incendiary devices in irregular warfare. He was thinking about the crew inside the tank that was still alive, and about the tanks behind this one, and about the bottle in his hand, and about what happened next. What happened next is what always happens when a man with nothing adequate faces something that requires adequacy. He uses what he has, and he does what he can, and he finds out afterward whether it was enough. At Suma, in December 1939, in Finland, enough times that it mattered, it was. Did you know Finland produced 450,000 of these bottles in 105 days and named the weapon after the man who said the bombs falling on Helsinki were bread? Write bottle in the comments if this changed how you think about what it actually means to face impossible odds, and tell us, if you had been in that foxhole when the tank rolled over you, do you think you would have gotten up? Subscribe if these forgotten corners of the war deserve a larger audience, and watch this next video. What Soviet commanders wrote in their diaries after fighting Finnish soldiers in this same forest will leave you unsettled in a completely different way.